But please pull those as far forward and make sure you speak directly into it so that she can hear and our witnesses, our members can hear as well. Trying to make everybody's job easier here this morning, okay? Well, let's get going here. Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, International Financial Institutions will come to order. The objection, chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Better Investment Barriers, Strengthening CCP Sanctions and Exploring Alternatives to Bureaucratic Regimes. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. With that, I recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. First, I want to thank our impressive set of witnesses for being here today. You each possess tremendous expertise on global economic security measures like sanctions, export controls, and CFIUS. We look forward to your insights. The National Security Subcommittee has made exposing the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party to the United States our top priority. Chairman McHenry shares this goal. The very first hearing this committee held in the 118th Congress was a full committee hearing tackling the economic competition with China, and our first subcommittee hearing looked at the CCP's business model that fuels the fentanyl crisis. I also serve on the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, where these concerns are the focus of our work. 2023 was a pivotal year in U.S.-Chinese economic relations, and one U.S. businesses and investors should reflect upon carefully before they continue to do business with the CCP. We saw Chinese security forces raid and imprison local staff at U.S. consulting firms, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, banned U.S. chipmaker Micron, detained a senior executive of Japan's Astellas Pharma Group, and hit London headquartered Deloitte with a record fine. This behavior hasn't let up this year. Earlier this month, the CCP announced sanctions on 5 U.S.-based companies, causing them to lose any property they have in China and prohibiting them from working with Chinese organizations and individuals. These new sanctions came as a result of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Top intelligence officials predict that China will invade Taiwan this decade, in which case more sanctions will come, and you can bet all U.S. direct investment in China will be nationalized. However, foreign companies continue to make substantial investments into China, and U.S. business executives continue to line up at the trough. Some even pay $2,000 a plate for the privilege of having dinner with Xi Jinping in San Francisco. We must make sure that those investments do not harm the security of the United States and our allies. So while this should serve as a major warning to U.S. investors who haven't yet got the message about the risk of doing business with Chinese organizations, it should also be a reminder to Congress that we need to get this right. We've been debating outbound investment screening for multiple Congresses and multiple White House administrations. Last August, the Biden administration released an executive order that took a targeted approach to restricting outbound investment. Chairman McHenry and I agreed this took a step in the right direction, but could be improved through legislative action, which is more permanent. Others in Congress are working on this issue. Last year, the Senate attempted to attach a provision to the NDAA, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee introduced its own bill. I applaud the efforts of my colleagues for continuing to think about how to address these challenges. We all share the same concerns around American investors feeding the beast that is the People's Republic of China. However, the best approach that I have seen on this front is the bill sponsored by my good friend, Mr. Andy Barr, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Monetary Policy, as well as a member of the subcommittee. His Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act passed through our committee with full bipartisan support, and I was a proud original co-sponsor as well. He also sits on the China Select Committee as a representative, like myself, from this committee. His legislation will require the president to impose sanctions on companies involved with China's defense or surveillance technology sectors. In my opinion, and the opinion of many on this committee, it is the bill that takes the toughest approach toward combating the economic threat of the CCP. At the same time, we cannot undermine the importance of a free market economy. So when we discuss this topic, it is critical to find the right balance between protecting Americans and our allies from the threats imposed by the Chinese Communist Party and other adversaries like Russia, while also promoting a global market that allows our economy to thrive without creating a sprawling new bureaucracy. I hope today's hearing will advance our productive conversations and help shape good policy for the American people. Again, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and yield the balance of my time. With that, the gentlelady from Ohio, the ranking member, has joined us, and we recognize her for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and certainly thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing here today to discuss the need for outbound investment screening. Since the enactment of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018, the latest law in review and potentially prohibits foreign investments into the United States that may pose a national threat. Congress has taken a closer look at the reverse, meaning United States financial investments in foreign countries and companies of concern. This includes, for example, funds from the United States into the People's Republic of China. Several policy options have been proposed to screen outbound investments, including sector-based and entity-based approaches. The Biden administration took the first significant step in issuing, as many of you may remember, Executive Order 14105 last August, which directed the Treasury Department to establish a program to screen certain United States investments in China that involve sensitive technologies and products that pose an acute national security risk, specifically technology sectors relevant to military intelligence, surveillance, or cyber-related capabilities. I applaud President Biden's actions, and now my colleagues and I right here in Congress, and more specifically in this committee, must act to codify and strengthen this effort to address tangible national security threats to our nation. As we consider how to merge all of these proposals, there are several additional areas of concern that I think I would be remiss to exclude. The first is incorporating consideration of supply chain resiliency, workers' interest, and climate risk, all of which have had a significant impact on our nation's economy and security. The second would be to review and potentially unwind existing United investments in China sectors of concern, augmenting the review of future investments in those same sectors. Finally, we need transparency into hidden funds, like passive forms of investing, such as mutual funds, index investing, that are not currently covered by many proposals. We may be also to get by leveraging work already done by the Securities and Exchange Commission and other agencies. It is important to note that while there may be varying approaches, there is a strong bipartisan, bicameral support for outbound investment screening. I look forward to learning more about the merits of the options presented as we explore the best way to ensure the United States investments are not in any way undermining our national security. Further, I'd like to point out that while outbound investment screening deserves our time and attention, we can close critical national security gaps in our legislative framework. It is also essential to our national security that we urgently provide aid to our allies in Ukraine and Israel. talking about national security while the president's supplemental request is left to language is at best disappointing. But once again, thank you for being here. And we always say how much we look forward to hearing from our witnesses, but here's an opportunity for you to actually help shape us and give us information because we do have bipartisan support. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. McHenry from North Carolina, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer, and thanks for holding this hearing. We agree that we must cut off revenue to the CCP's military-industrial complex and other bad actors, that's for sure. And it's critical we pursue solutions that don't kneecap one of our greatest strategic assets, which is our capital markets. I think it's important that as we work with House colleagues to build consensus on the right approach, using export controls and what has been a traditional statecraft and economic statecraft that the United States has had, we get the mechanics right so that regulators can implement these programs, so the private sector can abide by them, so we can actually have strength. Independent of hawks and doves and that debate, I think it comes down to whether you understand the issue. For example, a Control-F search for artificial intelligence, or AI, in recent corporate disclosures will yield thousands of results from every Fortune 500 company. So the Fortune 500 could be considered AI, all of them, if we get the regulations wrong, if we legislate inappropriately, and if we have a dumb approach. Let's have a smart approach, let's be effective, and let's do it together. Yield back.
Chairman yields back. With that, we will introduce our panel for today. We're excited about the witnesses we have. The Honorable Rich Ashooh. Mr. Ashooh is Corporate Vice President for Global Trade and Government Affairs for the Lamb Research Corporation. Welcome. Honorable Thomas Feddo. Mr. Feddo runs the Rubicon Advisors, LLC. Welcome. And Emily Kilcrease. Ms. Kilcrease is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Welcome. Thank each of you for taking time to be here today. Each of you recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be part of the record. And with that, Mr. Ashooh, you get to start. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Beatty, and also Chairman McHenry and the rest of the members of the committee. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. Having served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration at the Bureau of Industry and Security, I have both the honor and challenge of confronting many of the issues you all just described. And I'm happy to share my perspective on this. The concerns at the heart of this hearing are well-founded, and they derive from the oft-stated objective of the People's Republic of China to unseat U.S. technology leadership in the world. It's important to stress at the outset that U.S. technology leadership remains strong globally, and that the American culture of innovation is the envy of the world. I say that because it's essential for policymakers as you consider the challenge of promoting U.S. technology advancement while regulating it in the face of potential threats to cause no harm to the very thing you are trying to promote and protect. The progress that has been made in shoring up those protections by Congress is the result of legislation this committee has had a key role in enacting: the Export Control Reform Act and the Foreign Investment Risk Reduction Act, also known as ECRA and FIRMA, which were enacted in 2018. There are lessons from that debate which remain relevant, and I will confine my comments today to 3 recommendations drawn from those lessons. First, I urge you to leverage existing authorities. The temptation to address a broad panoply of legitimate interests which do not necessarily rise to the level of a national security threat is alluring. There's also a persistent temptation to regulate technologies that are important but may not constitute a threat to national security if shared beyond our borders. It is job number 1 for policymakers to clearly define and be specific in targeting legitimate security threats. One of the most crucial updates to FIRMA and ECRA was to dovetail their definitions and authorities, establishing a unified definition of critical technology and grounding that definition in well-defined export control lists, such as the Commerce Control List and the United States Munitions List, created clear, specific, updatable mechanisms for regulators to target specific threats. Prior to FIRMA and ECRA being enacted, agencies all worked under differing and competing ideas of what technology matters, wasting valuable time and effort on debates instead of action. This synchronization of definitions created a powerful alignment of authorities and should be the basis for any additional remedies being contemplated. Secondly, I urge you to act multilaterally. National security threats are rarely stovepiped. Solutions to address them should not be either. Therefore, just as multiple agencies must collaborate within the United States, it is essential that the U.S. seek multilateral collaboration with relevant allies. Many like-minded countries have in place national security reviews similar to those of the U.S., such as foreign direct investment screening and export controls, and we should work with them. Finally, we need to address the gaps. For all the measures in recent years to protect U.S. technology, gaps do remain. It is currently possible that export-controlled technology could be the beneficiary of U.S. financing. Before implementing a complex new regime, though, enhancements to current authorities should be considered first. For example, a recent amendment to the Export Administration Regulations defines the word support by U.S. persons to include, among other things, financing. While further study must be conducted, Congress and the executive branch should consider clearly defining this newly expanded definition to address the concerns around illicit financing of controlled and therefore critical technology. This feature of the law creates a regulatory hook to limit financial activities already tied to restrictions based on export controls. Another opportunity for improvement exists in the multilateral space. The need for alignment among specific technology-leading countries is recurring and should not be ad hoc. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and semiconductor development are examples of technologies where the most advanced capabilities reside in a small handful of countries. A coordinated agreement encircling key technologies, including the financing of them, is best done among the countries that control the development. The U.S., along with key allies, should consider a new method for multilateral controls in targeting technology areas that can work with but is separate from the existing multilateral regimes such as the Wassenaar Arrangement that have served the U.S. and partner nations well, but are ill-suited for the complex technology supply chains we're confronting today. Without such alignment, unilateral policy will ultimately fail in combating both the national security and economic threats coming from China. U.S. global leadership is indisputable, but it is perishable. Efforts such as the work of this committee is doing today are essential to maintaining it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. With that, Mr. Feddo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Lukemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, Chairman McHenry, almost exactly a year ago, I participated in the full committee's first substantive hearing of the 118th Congress, where we talked about the economic threat from China. I'm honored to appear before you today and continue that discussion. I don't think I'll get my spoken testimony done in 5 minutes, so I'll summarize. This conversation is about using existing authorities to combat that threat and to leverage those to protect U.S. national security interests and mitigate risks posed by certain U.S. private sector investments into the People's Republic of China. As you'll see from my testimony, I'm convinced that an economic sanctions program administered by Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control would be the most immediate, effective, and impactful way to address these risks. I previously served as the first Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Investment Security and oversaw the implementation of FIRMA at CFIUS. I've also spent 7 years in senior positions at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, administering enforcement of economic sanctions. And that's what I bring to this discussion. As I've emphasized in prior testimony, the dangers posed by the PRC are real and present and not over the horizon. And in the midst of an accelerating tech industrial revolution, the goal of maintaining tech superiority necessitates reinvigorating the defense industrial base, fostering research and development, strong partnerships with the private sector, and it also means careful and calibrated deployment of our economic might and related authorities through things such as economic sanctions, export controls, and CFIUS, what today is often referred to as economic statecraft. In recent years, some policymakers have urged the government to screen and regulate outbound capital flows through the creation of yet another regulatory authority, what has sometimes been referred to as outbound CFIUS, to regulate something called smart money. The scope of this ostensible national security gap has not been precisely defined, but in general is described as arising from a U.S. person, venture capital, or private equity investment into Chinese startups working in high-tech fields that could impact U.S. national security. And because, of course, money is fungible and could be replaced by other investors in Europe or Asia or the Chinese government itself, the focus has been on what comes in addition to that money, the intangibles, the management experience, the relationships, and likewise. The data regarding venture capital investment into startups into China is very limited. Yet, that is among the reasons I remain skeptical of the effectiveness of a new CFIUS-like regime to screen where and how Americans invest their funds and their capital. It would be regulation and resource intensive and slow and bureaucratic. In my view, also, Congress should lead on an issue of this complexity and potential impact, legislating a policy approach. The Treasury Secretary, and as you mentioned, the President issued Executive Order 14105 last summer, establishing a new regulatory regime. The Treasury Secretary has been directed to lead a notice and comment and the promulgation of rules. There's been notice and comment, and a final rule is anticipated at some point this year. 14105 is not a screening mechanism, but rather a series of investment prohibitions or notifications regarding semiconductors, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. There are additional legislative proposals to expand that to other high-tech sectors. As I point out in my testimony, this will mean new bureaucracy, new resources, new processes, and new regulations with yet another set of complications and unique set of costs. The limitations should be apparent. The responses to the proposed rule that Treasury issued were extensive, and they asked for answers from the public to more than 83 questions regarding scoping that new regime. There were more than 60 comments of substance to that process. Many of them were vague, complained about the vagueness, the broadness, and the complexity of the potential regime. I'm running out of time, but as you can see from my testimony, what I'm proposing is to use a time-tested economic sanctions regime to do exactly the same thing, because what the policymakers are concerned about is the intangibles that go with an investment flow, and that is inherently something that sanctions are well suited for. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. With that, Ms. Kilcrease, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Beatty, members of the subcommittee, and Chairman McHenry of the full committee. It's an honor to be here to testify before you today, and thank you for your important attention to this issue of outbound investment. Please let me know that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. My comments draw from a large body of research that I've conducted on sanctions, export controls, and investment security at the Center for New American Security, as well as prior experience serving the U.S. public in roles at the Department of Commerce, National Security Council, and U.S. Trade Representative. I've spent my career in national security roles, but always from the perspective of an economic agency. And this has ingrained in me a deep appreciation for the strategic advantage that open markets and open capital flows provide the United States, as well as the need to proceed with care and thoughtful deliberation when imposing national security guardrails that are necessary to prevent exploitation of our open markets. With that in mind, I offer a set of principles that should guide the development of any future controls on U.S. investments in China, as well as concrete policy options for your consideration. On principles, any new outbound investment controls should be tightly targeted to investment transactions that present high national security risk, arising from the transfer of non-technical industrial expertise that can fuel the indigenous development of critical technologies in China. Controls should be clearly defined and understandable to private sector entities who are always the first line of compliance. They should be non-duplicative and reinforcing of existing tools, particularly export controls. They should be scoped proportionately to the administrative capacity available to effectively administer a new mechanism while avoiding unnecessary process and bureaucracy. And they should be designed to enable meaningful conversations with allies about adopting similar regimes, as a unilateral approach to outbound investments will hurt U.S. competitiveness without having any meaningful impact on Chinese tech companies. With these core principles in mind, the committee may wish to consider a targeted set of policy options in addition to leveraging existing tools. And I offer this set of options today as a package, as each addresses a particular area of risk associated with outbound investment. And these include enhanced transparency, targeted technology-based prohibitions, and entity-based prohibitions. The United States does need more transparency around U.S. investments in China, and Congress could consider a tailored set of mandatory notifications for certain U.S. investments made into Chinese companies that make high-risk technologies. And these notifications, of course, should be subject to strict confidentiality protections. Both when I was in government and now as an independent researcher, I can confirm that it is exceedingly difficult to gain detailed information on specific investment transactions made in China, particularly in the startup space. Having said that, there are a set of investments that would inarguably, in my view, present national security risks and should be prohibited. These include investments in Chinese companies that make technologies that would be subject to the U.S. arms embargo if originating in the United States, or otherwise subject to high levels of dual-use export controls. There's a common sense logic to using investment controls to ensuring that U.S. financing is not eroding the efficacy of our export control programs, particularly as it relates to the transfer of non-technical industrial expertise that can occur through an investment. Sectors included in the prohibitions should include advanced semiconductors and related equipment and software, in alignment with the government's efforts ongoing to keep the United States as far ahead as possible in this critical technology area that enables U.S. military, national security, and economic functions. There is also emerging consensus on the need to set controls on frontier AI systems based on the computing power of these systems, and my written statement provides additional information and technical resources on that point. In addition to targeted sectoral restrictions, Congress may wish to consider entity-based restrictions. Expansion of the non-SDN Chinese Military Industrial Complex Program, or CMIC program, to prohibit investments of all types, not just publicly traded securities, can provide a well-calibrated entity-based tool. Entity-based approaches alone will not be sufficient, as they are inherently reactive in nature, and each listing requires lengthy, in-depth analysis. But they can provide an important complement to tailored technology-based prohibitions, where the government has knowledge that a particular entity is acting in a manner contrary to U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. Finally, the ongoing debate on outbound investment controls reflects how novel this type of program would be for the United States. It's critical that there be a regular process to evaluate the effectiveness of any new outbound program. Evaluation is an area where the United States unfortunately usually falls short, but it's critical to ensure that any novel economic security tools are meeting Congress's national and economic security objectives. It is essential that Congress act. Doing so can ensure the durability and appropriate scoping of any new outbound program and the alignment of resources for effective implementation and enforcement, as Congress so wisely did during the 2018 CFIUS reform process. Let me end by noting that while today we're focused on a particular set of economic restrictions, it is equally critical that the United States not lose sight of the need for an affirmative strategy to engage in the global economy and set the terms of trade to U.S. advantage. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentlelady yields back that the ranking member of the full committee has arrived, and we'll recognize the gentlelady from California for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lukemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty. In August, President Biden issued an executive order to initiate America's first program to screen U.S. investments overseas, particularly those funding China-based firms, to prevent U.S. dollars from being used to develop the Chinese military. I support the legislative effort to codify and strengthen Biden's order and urge my colleagues to go further by extending the screening to existing investment contracts and not just future investments, ensuring transparency into private equity and venture capital funds, which represent billions of opaque dollars, and screening investments for their impact on environmental and social concerns, like human rights, because they can harm our national security. We have an opportunity here to ensure that none of America's resources are used to undermine our country or support our adversaries. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now we turn to member questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. You know, Mr. Barr has got a bill that deals with outbound investments, which I think is probably the best answer to what we're talking about here this morning, and I'm going to try and set the stage for him to, he's very eloquent and a whole lot smarter than I am, so I'm going to set the stage for him this morning with regards to some of my questions. But each of you this morning made a comment with regards to emphasizing the fact that we need to have a strategy. We need to understand how we can curtail investment in China in a way that protects the United States as well as hurts the Chinese as much as possible. So, Mr. Feddo, in your illustrious career here, you've been working with different sanctions and export controls. It would appear to me that we need to be able to work with our allies to make those sanctions and export controls effective. Can you explain to me how that can happen? Is it happening? Do we have a plan?
I don't know whether it's happening or we have a plan, but of course, any of these economic statecraft tools, in my opinion, are better and more effective if there is a multilateral approach. For example, in the course of implementation of FIRMA and the expansion of CFIUS authorities, we spent a great deal of time encouraging other countries to develop similar screening mechanisms for inbound capital that could pose national security risks. And so that is something that I think makes these sorts of economic statecraft tools more effective.
You know, it appeared to me, and I say this all the time, that the more you enhance the China economy, the better you're feeding the beast that's going to eat us at some point. And so to me, this is really, really important that we get this right, that we understand that we need to minimize our investment there and find a way to slowly decouple ourselves from Chinese investment and Chinese trade. But doing that is the trick. And one of the things that came up this morning in our Chinese Select Committee was the fact that Chinese economy is slowing. You know, yesterday or the day before, the court in Hong Kong told Evergrande, one of the largest real estate companies in China, to start liquidating. The whole Chinese economy is teetering right now from the standpoint demographically. They're in trouble. The real estate market is collapsing, and a lot of the trade with the rest of the world is going down, other than the automobile industry that we saw yesterday with a meeting that we had that's going up. So the question, I guess, is if we can, how dangerous is China if we weaken them? Does that entice them into reacting more aggressively against China, or against Taiwan, or continuing to build up relationships with Iran and Russia? Or is it because they can get fat and happy, so to speak? Does that enable them to sort of sit back and be more predictive whenever they're trying to do something else? Mr. Ashooh, would you like to answer that question?
That is certainly the risk that should be contemplated in whatever strategy we pursue. It's important to know that China has definitive red lines that they will not veer from. Taiwan, for example. My sense is, from a U.S. strategy point of view, a desired outcome would be a China that is in many ways dependent on the U.S. In some ways, they are. There's technologies that they don't have and we do. We should seek to grow that dependency. It allows for commerce to occur, but it also ensures that it is not a level playing field. That is, to me, the sort of balance that could strike, if you will, a compromise between pushing China too far in either direction.
You know, one of the things that came out of the meeting this morning, Secretary Burnett made a comment that not only do we want to try and deter and sort of hit the Chinese economy, but we have to make sure our economy is strong as well. And you kind of hit on that a little bit. If we make them dependent on us, it helps us to be stronger as well. And he also made a comment with regards to we either provide leadership or we govern by crisis. That's a pretty interesting comment. It means we got to start leading instead of following. We have to provide leadership, especially in something like this. We need to set parameters. Mr. Feddo, would you comment just for a second with regards to the regime and sanctions that are Mr. Barr's bill? Do you like those? Do you think it's going to work?
I do. Most of my written testimony is about the benefits of using economic sanctions to tackle this problem, because fundamentally it's about modifying the conduct of U.S. persons, right? It's not about the fungible money, it's about what comes with it. And so what we're trying to do is modify or deter or change behavior of U.S. persons to eliminate what comes with that money, the services, essentially, all of the experience and the like that comes with those funds.
Thank you. My time has expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Ohio, ranking member, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to the witnesses. There's been a lot of language that has been, all three of you have said, we need to tackle this problem, transparency. And I'd like to also share that one of my colleagues, Congressman Greg Meeks, who serves on the full Financial Services Committee, he is not on this subcommittee, but he's also the past chair of Foreign Affairs and serves with my other colleague, Mr. McCall. They too have come up with a piece of legislation that looks at transparency and looks at outbound investments, which I think is a good thing, that we have multiple ways we can look at this. And so I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think it's another option for us as well. So I would like to go first to you, Ms. Kilcrease. There are a number of different ways that the United States government can track and review and restrict certain United States outbound investments. And we've seen many of the proposals presented in Congress, which vary by approach. The countries of concern, the sectors, and the structures of investment targeted. Can you kind of help enlighten us on what are the primary United States concerns that must be addressed in a screening regime, and what would be the most effective ways to address them?
Thank you for the question. And again, it is good to see so many good ideas coming out of Congress on this. Ultimately, there's three elements of what I think would be an effective outbound process. There is a strong need to increase transparency and having the visibility into the types of investments that are being made and the types of rights that convey with those investments, and how those particular investments may be supporting China's indigenous critical technology developments in a way that's contrary to U.S. national security interests. We just don't have that visibility across the full range of investment flows and transactions that would be necessary to make me feel comfortable as someone who cares about national security. Having said that, I do think that the entity-based approaches that have been discussed as well have some benefits. There's certainly a benefit to changing behaviors of targeted actors, as Mr. Feddo noted. But there's also a benefit in the technology-based restrictions. Again, thinking about how we can align these tools with existing mechanisms like export controls, we can think about investment controls as another leg to support the export control system, which itself has a variety of tools encompassed within it. It has end-user controls, end-use controls, list controls. We can think of investment controls as another way to reinforce and bootstrap those sorts of mechanisms.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just kind of go a little deeper on that. What do you think is the best approach for defining which activities or sectors should be subject to notification or review or restrictions or waivers? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Here again, I come back to leveraging the existing list that we have in the export control system. The United States government, through the U.S. munitions list and through the commerce control list, has already identified a wide range of technologies that are critical for U.S. national security interests. And so as we think about scoping investment controls, we should be thinking about how to target our transparency as well as our prohibition efforts on those exact sets of technologies as well, which again have already been identified. I don't think we want to create new lists or create a new bureaucratic structure that has to come up with new lists. We've got them and we could leverage those existing systems.
Mr. Feddo, you also referenced President Biden's executive order and what it did in another piece of legislation that I referenced earlier with Mr. McCall and Mr. Meeks. They also talk about in that transparency and taking it a step further. I don't know if you've had any opportunity to review or see their legislation, but I'd be interested in any comments on that.
So I have seen it. I think it essentially, as you suggest, reinforces Executive Order 14105. As my written testimony articulates, my concern with that approach is that it's very time intensive. It's sort of reinventing the wheel and creating a new set of restrictions and regulations and requirements. And in fact, what I propose with respect to my approach is a combination of both. It's essentially a sanctions-related approach that leverages export controls, as my two co-panelists have suggested, which I think has benefits, but focusing on broad sectors and then trying to define those sectors, it's going to take a great deal of time. It has already taken.
I think I know my time is up, but it sounds like we may get a third approach to that as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go with the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, who's chairman of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee on Banking. Mr. Barr is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the important hearing. Let's, Mr. Feddo, cut to the chase on the three major legislative proposals before us in the Congress. One, my bill, a bill that this committee has marked up, the Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act. That's an entity-based approach that uses OFAC to impose sanctions on Chinese entities of concern. Then there is the McCall-Meeks bill, a sector-based approach to Preventing Adversaries from Developing Critical Capabilities Act. That bill was marked up out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And then there's the Casey Cornyn approach in the Senate, the Outbound Investment Transparency Act, which is basically an investment notification regime. Mr. Feddo, which of these three approaches would hit Chinese military and intelligence companies or the CMIC entities harder?
Well, in my view, it's clearly your bill, Mr. Barr, because it immediately identifies those entities of concern which are on various lists with various levels of restrictions, immediately making them blocked persons, which, under economic sanctions regimes, a blocked person, virtually any dealing is prohibited with that person who's blocked. And so if we're trying to eliminate the intangibles related to that go with money, those are immediately eliminated, not just for investors, but for any U.S. person that might be aiding or supporting one of those entities.
Well, I appreciate your pointing that out. I do want to compliment and applaud my colleagues and friends, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, Senators Casey and Cornyn, for their well-intentioned and patriotic efforts here to get at this problem of financing entities of concern. But Mr. Feddo, the argument in favor of this sector-based outbound investment regime is that it's forward-looking as opposed to backward-looking. That's the criticism of my bill, principally, that an entity-based sanctions approach would be under-inclusive, perhaps, and would fail to get at these venture-stage Chinese entities of concern. What is wrong with that analysis, in your view?
Well, I personally think that, there are a couple of things that are wrong. One is, if we've already identified entities of concern that are affiliated with civil-military fusion, then we ought to attack that problem right away. That's sort of an 80-20 attack of a problem. Furthermore, as I referenced in my opening statement, we're in the midst of a tech-industrial revolution that's moving so fast. Even a sector approach is going to be chasing its tail to some extent and reactive as well, because the technology ostensibly that we want to control is constantly moving forward and changing, and so we'll be chasing that as well.
Do these non-sanctions approaches, these sector-based approaches, do they have multilateral effect in the same way that a sanctions approach does?
Well, certainly not. I don't think so. I mean, especially not with a blocking an SDN listing, because that is the most powerful type of sanction we have. But even with a more tailored prohibition, the U.S. financial system becomes off limits for dealing with those named entities. It's immediate.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that the executive order and these other approaches, Casey Cornyn, McCall, Meeks, they're only restrictions on U.S. investment. And these Chinese entities of concern can get subsidies from the central government of China. They can get money is fungible. They can get non-U.S. investment funds, and it's the know-how that they want. Mr. Ashooh, you made the important point that we should leverage existing authorities, and you point out the need for specific, clear, targeted, and well-defined action against these entities of concern in China. Does a sector-based approach place the enforcement responsibility on the private sector or the government?
Thank you, Mr. Barr. I'm not sure where it places the responsibility, and that's the problem with such a broad-based approach. I think a sectoral approach expresses maybe a shared concern, but as far as an implementation of authorities with effect, it's very challenging to do so. And I congratulate you on your approach because it does the tests that I laid out in my testimony about using existing authorities, being multilateral, addressing the gaps. Your bill marks all three.
Well, clarity and targeted and defined is very, very important, and a sanctions approach does that. It's red light, green light. There's no ambiguous yellow light, and that's what I'm concerned about, a sector-based approach, a big yellow light and a lot of confusion by the private sector whether the investment is okay or impermissible. Without a yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to direct this question to Mr. Kilcrease. I'm pleased that we're hosting this hearing today and that we all agree that there's a need for review and in some cases, maybe, prohibitions on American investments in companies and technology that present a national security threat to the United States and its interests. I fully support President Biden's bold efforts to establish a formal outbound investment screening mechanism, which is limited to a narrow set of sectors where U.S. funds, such as those from pensions and savings of teachers, construction workers, and government workers, could end up fueling the Chinese military. For most Democrats and Republicans in Congress, it is clear that American investments should not prop up our adversaries' development of artificial intelligence, surveillance, and other technologies that could be used against us. There are a number of bills that aim to codify the president's actions in some form. On many national security issues, this Congress, especially the GOP-led majority in the House, have talked a lot but acted little. And so this is an area that I think we've got to pay special attention. However, I want to make sure that we're not in any way crippling American investments and misidentifying them or basically understanding what they do and what they don't do. This should be based on facts and good information about what kind of American investments we're talking about. But we've got to be concerned about our national security. So what do you think about Ms. Kilcrease? In light of Chinese military ambitions on the growing threats from climate change, why do we need to act now and expanding outbound investment screening to protect American national security?
Thank you for the question. It is quite clear that we are in the middle of a generational challenge with China, and it's a challenge unlike one we've ever seen before because of the interconnected nature of our technology ecosystems and our economies. And it is, I think, a growing shared concern, including amongst my panelists here, that investments are part of that problem. And so the debate now is how to fix that in a way that maintains the U.S. advantage in open markets while getting at those investment transactions and flows in the most effective way, the most proactive way that sheds light and transparency into dark pools of money in areas where we don't have great visibility as the U.S. government to enable us to take action in a strong yet targeted way against those high-risk investment transactions.
As you know, there are a number of thoughtful approaches that you have mentioned and that you have talked about, including President Biden's bold executive order from last August that aimed to review and potentially prohibit investments from the U.S. into countries and sectors that could pose a threat to our national security. For example, we don't want American capital funding the development of Chinese surveillance tools that will be used to spy on Americans. We don't want U.S. money to help the Chinese Communist Party to develop artificial intelligence that will be used to breach our defenses or undermine our elections. Most Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate agree. These proposals will be further strengthened by adding a review of rescinding existing investments some private equity in investments that made last year extend for another 5 to 10 years and will continue to transfer American know-how. And I'm worried about this, and I want us to spend some time with private equity and venture capitalists to not only warn and educate them about what we're trying to do and see how much cooperation we can get before we make certain conclusions. But I think it's important for us to pay attention to them and interact with them so that we absolutely accomplish our mission of protecting this country from, the Chinese type surveillance, et cetera, but at the same time, do not undermine what they're attempting to do that we think is good for America in terms of venture capital and even private equity. Thank you. I yield back.
Lady yields back. With that, go the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield a few moments to my good friend from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
I thank the gentleman. One quick question, follow-up to Mr. Ashooh. U.S. foreign direct investment in China rose rapidly in the 2000s and 2010s. But according to a recent report by a Goldman Sachs research arm citing U.S. Department of Treasury data, suggests that foreign investors have reduced exposure to China bonds and equities over the past 3 years. Why is that?
I think there are multiple factors, but let me take one recent historical factor that I think matters. Hong Kong. Hong Kong had a very separate trading system with the U.S. from China, and we saw what happened there. In fact, in the middle of my term at BIS, we had to change drastically how we treated Hong Kong as an entity, and I think that the risks that were presented by that are present within mainland China itself, and that's one example of why it's become so risky.
So investors are starting to figure out that China is a bad investment. So what you're saying is free market capitalism works?
Sure does.
I yield.
I think it's indisputable that a rising China is a threat to the United States, both for our economy and our national security. I think most of us would agree that the threat is immediate and real. That said, I think America's free market ideals are more compelling. There are a more compelling alternative for the business than the heavy-handed approach taken by the Chinese Communist Party. Instead of crafting a brand new outbound investment screening regime, we should continue to empower American investors and improve the tools necessary to surgically target bad actors and cut them off from our financial system. Mr. Ashooh, in your testimony, you mentioned that the American culture of innovation remains the envy of the world. What are some of the specific traits and characteristics that American business leaders bring to the boards of foreign companies?
That Americans bring to the board of foreign?
Yes. What are some of those ideas and innovations that we do bring?
So I think that the key to American innovation, which is hard to export, is openness. We are, as a country, we are a welcoming environment to the best ideas wherever they reside. And then we use an export control system to manage those ideas so they don't happen in the wrong place. I think that is what any American technology executive could bring, which is this idea of openness within limits.
So basically taking the culture of freedom and liberty that we have here in America and implanting it, per se, in Chinese companies. Is that?
Well, I think it's part of the reason why we want to be globally expansive as a country with our economic principles. We want others to share those, not always successfully, but I think the effort needs to be there.
I think you may have touched on this, but are Americans currently permitted to serve on the board of Chinese companies? And if so, are there laws and regulations in place that make it difficult for an American to serve on a board?
I think there's absolutely restrictions in some countries. I think we're probably talking about China here, which is very, very mindful of the role Americans play in the Chinese business establishment.
So, but legally they can serve in certain conditions.
I know of no law. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but that is nothing. Yeah, that's nothing I'm aware of.
Can you explain why it may be beneficial for the United States to have Americans serving on the boards of foreign companies, specifically China, which you've touched on? But does having American executives serving on foreign boards have a strategic benefit for the U.S.? I mean, a long-range benefit.
It does, and it refers back to something I said earlier, which is one possible strategic goal for the United States is creating a dependency, a leverage over China. That can be technology, but can also be in the form of individuals. I think it's always good for us to be in a position of superiority relative to economics, technology, and so on.
So for a lack of a better term, maybe gaining some intelligence on the direction that certain companies that may be competitive to American companies would be taking.
One of the things, again, back to my days at BIS, one of the things we were always concerned about when we took an action like a particular sanction or restriction was that we would then lose information. That doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do, but there is a cost to it. And having the information, having an understanding of Chinese technology development is key to exceeding it.
All right. Thank you. I see my time's expired. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Gonzalez recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you to the panel for participating today. My question is to Ms. Kilcrease. Ms. Kilcrease, I'm pleased that President Biden initiated the outbound investment screening program, that I'm looking forward to see what Treasury produces as it does its part to complete the rulemaking process. No doubt U.S. money should not be going to Chinese or Russian firms that use these funds to build technology to support current or future acts of aggression against the U.S. and our allies. And I agree too with the Ranking Member Waters' proposal that we need transparency in existing investments in those same sectors of concern, that we may not need to consider if and how to unwind those hidden fees that are not currently covered by the bills that we're discussing today. I'll add another angle and would like your feedback. Where I am in Texas, my constituents see Chinese money flooding into Mexico across the border from us, where manufacturing facilities are developed south of the border so goods can be shipped into the U.S. as Mexican goods instead of Chinese. And I worry that if we consider only the direct U.S. investment into Chinese or Russian factories that produce technology of concern, those investments may be directed instead to overseas factories and Chinese-owned companies in third nations. Would it be useful for congressional proposals to consider these sort of nonlinear investments that aim to evade the goals of the President's outbound investment screening program? If not this mechanism, by what capacity could we prevent U.S. investments from funding, for example, a semiconductor factory in Mexico that's owned by Chinese entities?
Thank you. These are an excellent set of questions, and perhaps I'll start with the last one. You know, when we look at the question of third-party markets and investments made outside of China, there's a question about how much we try to expand the extraterritorial reach of U.S. tools and what the balance is with trying to work with partners so that they're strengthening their own legal mechanisms to get at these sorts of risks. You know, ultimately, over the long term, while Congress should always look at evasion routes and circumvention, particularly for the cases that you just outlined very well, you know, we also need to be working with partners like Mexico, with whom we have an FTA, to make sure that we are encouraging them to put in place their own protections for their own investors and domestic manufacturing capabilities as well. It's not going to be one tool fixes all of these problems. We need to think about multiple tools, including the international engagement part, to think about how we can get at this issue holistically, because you're absolutely right. If we shut down one particular bilateral flow, it will shift, there will be adaptation. That is what we always see after a heavy sanctions regime is put into place. To the question on unwinding transactions or worrying about legacy stock of investments, I do think that is worthy of attention. It is, of course, more complicated as you think about looking back at the transactions that may have been made legally at the time, but nonetheless still present a risk. And I think the Ranking Member Waters talked about the need to work with the private sector to do additional study on these sorts of ongoing risks arising from legacy investments, and I think that would certainly be worthy of additional congressional action.
Thank you. Yes, I think I agree with you. As you know, private equity funds and other private funds that raise capital in the United States almost exclusively use methods and certain exemptions under the securities laws that were meant for privately held operating companies. These capital raising activities and unregistered and unregulated, and this committee has had difficulty ascertaining the extent of these activities. As far as we know, the administration too is unable to accurately assess the scope of capital raising activities in the U.S. by private funds that are directed to China. What are, in your opinion, what are some of the risks associated with this opaque and often untraceable capital? And what do you think we should be doing in Congress to address this?
Yes, thank you for the question. In the context of a historically large number of sanctions programs and sanctions programs that are increasingly targeted at larger economies, there will be massive amounts of evasion attempts, and we should anticipate that. Dark pools of money where we don't have visibility and transparency, of course, should be of high national security concern, because that is exactly where these illicit actors will try to funnel money to get around our sanctions enforcement efforts. So Congress should continue to look at how we can, again, bring transparency to enable us to think about additional legislative solutions and enforcement mechanisms to address those dark pools.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. I thank Chairman Lukemeyer for holding today's hearing. Pretty critical issue, the approach we take in regulating the flow of capital into China. I do support the approach taken by Mr. Barr's bill, H.R. 760, which employs a scalpel-like approach in addressing the complex issue of sanctions. I do think focusing on a clearly defined areas of risk, H.R. 760 ensures that investments to U.S. investors are not inadvertently hindered and doesn't give Europeans or the rest of the world, for that matter, a free pass. So, Mr. Feddo, you led CFIUS effectively during your time in the Trump administration. Can you elaborate why setting up a type of new-bound investment plan would create a new regime, would create more bureaucracy than using the tools of the Office of Foreign Asset Control as described in Mr. Barr's bill?
Thank you, Mr. Muser. Let me just say, whatever Congress legislates, there will be resource costs associated with it. My view articulated in my written testimony is that in creating yet another regulatory regime, instead of relying on existing regimes, existing definitions, existing infrastructure, a huge institutional wealth of institutional knowledge and experience at OFAC and other parts of the U.S. government that have been implementing and administering sanctions for a very long time. Instead of leveraging that and having an efficiency factor and an immediacy to what the Congress does, drafting new regulations, redefining terms, explaining and scoping what a sector like artificial intelligence is, it's incredibly difficult, and it will take more resources and more time than I think the administration or the Congress expects. And if we really want to attack this problem as quickly as possible, a bill like Mr. Barr's bill does that right away and leverages work that the government has already done identifying entities of concern. Furthermore, sanctions have this ripple effect that we talked about. One that's really important, I didn't get to mention from my testimony, is this idea of the 50% rule. If a party is blocked, any entity or JV that it has 50% or more ownership interest in is also blocked by operation of law. That has a huge effect on affiliates and subsidiaries of the named entity. Whereas, for example, in the CMIC sanctions, there's no 50% rule, and it has little effect. So there are ways to do this without reinventing the wheel and spending an immense amount of time drafting regulations that will inherently be confusing for the private sector.
Thank you. Mr. Ashooh, the private sector has been reacting. What are your thoughts on the so-called de-risking, as we put it, as opposed to decoupling, as well as investors' attitudes for the last couple of years towards China, as far as foreign investment goes?
Sure. We've seen the de-risking happening. It's happening because it's apparent to anybody investing in China that the risks have gone up. I mentioned Hong Kong as a very sobering example of how the Chinese approach to economics has changed. We see human rights violations without peer in the Xinjiang province, and the U.S. took action to deal with that, but those infractions still continue. So it's not getting any better. And I think that in the case of, in particular, private industry, on whom the U.S. government relies for U.S. policy to be effective. Remember, in the case of financials or technology, those two areas are so broad and vast. The U.S. government can't possibly implement the policy on its own. It needs the cooperation of industry. And in the case of de-risking, there are many ways serving U.S. policy for us.
Okay. So looks like China is certainly lacking in capital investment. Do you feel that they'll be able to make up for it, or do you see a downward trend in China manufacturing as well as their economic viability?
So obviously their system is not a capitalist one, and it's difficult to predict. But I will say this: the answer has a lot to do with what the U.S. does.
I'm sorry, I'm over time. We'll talk later. Sure. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nichols, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Ludemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty. We're holding this hearing in the name of national security while simultaneously jeopardizing our national security by failing to provide needed aid to our allies in Ukraine and in Israel. We should be talking about Ukraine and the urgent need to stand with our allies. Listen, I believe that a majority of my colleagues in the Republican conference support aid to Israel and Ukraine, yet we continue to fail to act. And it's a shame because a bipartisan majority in Congress supports doing these things for our national security. Yet a minority of the Republican Congress seems to have the power to block action. Ukraine is running out of bullets in their war for democracy against Putin, and our ally Israel faced the deadliest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. The time for action is now. Every day we fail to act is a gift to Vladimir Putin, and if we gift wrap Ukraine and hand it over to Russia, it will be among the greatest failures of American foreign policy in our nation's history. Russia will not stop with Ukraine. While the costs of standing with Ukraine are high, we'll spend 100 times more money containing and embolden Russia around the globe if we fail to act. But on today's hearing on outbound investment in China, it's certainly important as China's growing role in the international economic landscape generates legitimate questions and concerns. Competing effectively with the Chinese Communist Party is essential for our national interest. The Chinese Communist Party's military-civil fusion policy, which demands that all Chinese firms support military needs upon request, poses a direct challenge to our national security and economic integrity. We should work together across party lines to develop a strategic and transparent approach to outbound investment that safeguards our national interests without stifling economic growth. We don't want U.S. capital inadvertently bolstering China's military capabilities. I'd also like to note that we should also be screening outbound investments to places like Russia, Iran, and North Korea. First question to you, Ms. Kilcrease. To what extent is the U.S. government currently in a position to effectively understand, monitor, or control outbound investment activities?
Thank you for the question, sir. And it's worth noting, across the range of adversaries that you just noted, there are certainly restrictions, particularly in the Russia case, related to outbound investments under existing sanction regimes. So I would hope that that investment flow has dried up at this point, given the existing sanctions. But on the broader issue of transparency and disclosure, this has been a common theme that has come up, where we know that there is a concern, but it's difficult to get precision around exactly the types of risks that can present and the types of transactions that are actually happening in the wild, particularly as we think about evasion and circumvention of increasingly sophisticated actors. So there's certainly a need for increased transparency.
Thanks. And again to you, considering the Chinese Communist Party's military-civil fusion policy, could you explain how the Chinese government might use this strategy to encourage foreign investments into China, specifically to facilitate technology and capital transferred to Chinese firms?
Absolutely. It's one of the challenges in trying to craft a targeted regime, whether it's under export controls or investment controls, where you're trying to distinguish civilian and military end uses in the China market. Military civil fusion makes that an increasingly complicated effort to do. And I think what we're starting to see in government policy making, including through the administration's October 7th export controls, is a movement towards a countrywide approach, where we're just setting clear technical parameters for what sorts of technology are most relevant to national security, and saying that no export can go beyond that technical parameter that's clearly defined in regulation. That's why in this conversation, we keep coming back to the technology approach in addition to an entity approach, because we have these clear definitions in the export control context, and we can leverage those to get at this countrywide approach in response to those exact concerns you just mentioned about the military civil fusion.
Thanks. Ms. Kilcrease, what is the most effective way to decide which sectors or activities need screening? Notifications, reviews, restrictions? What do you think?
I do think here is where we can leverage the great work that's already been done by our export control agencies. We have the U.S. munitions list, we have the U.S. commerce control list. There has already been a great deal of work to define with great technical detail and published in a public way specific technologies that are controlled. And I think that is exactly the kind of work that we can build on when we think of outbound investment controls. We can't just say AI, we need to get very specific about what we're talking about.
Thanks so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Then we go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, the Chairman of the Small Business Committee, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The People's Republic of China has an extensive history of withholding, falsifying, and manipulating data for purposes to benefit themselves, avoid international financial law, and conceal their dealings with hostile actors. We know that the CCP has developed partnerships with other dangerous actors like the Russians, North Koreans, as well as aiding South American drug cartels through the money laundering operations and as a supplier of chemicals. These affiliations are extremely concerning and highlight the need for the United States intervention in demanding more transparency in the Chinese financial system. And the bill that I co-lead, the China Financial Threat Mitigation Act, which passed the House, is a positive step in the right direction of examining these threats and further understanding of China's financial capacity. So, Mr. Feddo, how can the United States achieve greater transparency in the Chinese financial system, and what are the Chinese so afraid of us finding?
I don't know how we necessarily force transparency. I'm not familiar with the bill, but the context with which you just set it up, I have no disagreements that we need greater transparency and to demand an understanding of their financial system. I'm happy to come back to you with.
Well, what are they concerned about us finding, do you think?
With their closed financial system. They don't. It's
right.
They're a communist country, and they want to withhold that kind of information.
Okay, so the rate of Chinese advancement in the field of semiconductors is another threat to U.S. National security. We're now in a global race to dominate the chip industry and must explore all options to curb Chinese dominance in semiconductor development. But despite restrictions put in place by the United States, reports show that the Chinese government and military are still purchasing chips through an underground market. These chips have enormous military applications in weapon systems and cybersecurity and reconnaissance, and they also play a fundamental role in artificial intelligence technology, which has begun to change the way military and cyber operations are conducted. So in order to protect U.S. national security interests, we must get Chinese application of this technology under control. So Mr. Ashooh, could you elaborate on China's efforts to obtain semiconductor manufacturing equipment and their ability to develop artificial intelligence technologies and military applications with this equipment?
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Because I actually work for one of the leading global equipment providers, let me reinforce that I'm speaking on my own behalf today. But the issue you raise is key. The equipment is the enabling capability. It's well sought after, and it's another case where muscular use of export controls has worked, and it has worked in that during my time at BIS. One of the number one complaints any Chinese bilateral conversation the U.S. had, the number one complaint was over U.S. export controls, which is a good sign that the system is working.
In recent years, the Biden administration has increased regulations on American businesses, which is allowing our adversaries to gain competitive disadvantages or advantages. Decisions like restricting access to political capital through Basel III endgame proposal, halting U.S. exports of LNG, and increased burdensome regulations and reporting requirements will all come down to U.S. companies becoming unable to operate in a way that bolsters our economy. And it's important that we return policies to put the United States first and continue to establish a competitive advantage globally. We have to be the strongest. So, Mr. Ashooh, can you expand on the need for pro-U.S. policy and how increased regulations can hurt our competitiveness on the world stage and open the door for China to establish global dominance?
Absolutely. Sir, the U.S. can't out-China China in being overly restrictive, in picking and choosing winners, and having a system that's determined from the top down. The U.S., the magic of our system has been we inspire innovation and then turn that into business success. That has to be a global proposition, and it has to be one where we have friends and allies globally. China's not one of them right now. We need to work with those that are. And those two combinations, our innovation, our execution, and working with partners globally is what will keep us ahead.
Yeah, America first.
You said it.
Thank you. I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields, and with that, we go to the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Pedersen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being with us today. Since I'm usually almost last, being a freshman, most of my questions have been answered, and so I want to go beyond the scope of what we've talked about so far. And when I think about my 4-year-old son and the world that he's going to grow up in, and whether or not the United States is going to continue to lead, there are a few things that are deeply concerning for me with what we're facing now in Congress. Something that we know that is detrimental to the future success of China is their demographics. They simply don't have the population to meet the future economic needs. We know that they recognize this, and that's why they have updated their immigration system to make sure that they're bringing in the people to fill that void. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have rhetoric and the inability to come together on addressing our failed immigration system. We have cut off for decades the ability to bring people to the United States to meet our current needs, let alone we are not going to be able to meet the future needs. So you talked about, Mr. Ashooh, the need to have the competitive advantage around technology and also people. So can you talk about what we should consider here in Congress with our current, in Colorado, we have 2 jobs open for every person that's looking, and every single business leader that I talk to is begging for people to come here to have legal pathways. And they say they come here and they come to get the best education, they want to work in the United States, and then we send them away to work for our competitors. So our inability to actually address the human capital needs of our country, are you worried about the future of the United States if we don't come together to address this?
What a thoughtful question, and I am going to take it back to the a point I made earlier about the U.S. system of innovation being the envy of the world. It is because of the dynamics you just mentioned. Not only in our open society, when we welcome those from other countries into our nation, we benefit from what they know, but in many ways, and certainly in the case of adversaries, which is why we actually allow immigrants from Iran, from Russia, from China, because we want to take what they know and we want to deny it to others. And the U.S. system is one that allows people properly regulated to flourish, and we benefit as a nation, and I believe the world benefits from those priorities that the U.S. is able to implement.
Well, now, thank you for that. I've heard from many companies that the benefit that we have in the United States is people actually want to be here, but we have a huge gap in actually creating those opportunities and pathways. The other concern I have, being a freshman, like I mentioned in Congress, it seems like we create chaos here, unnecessary. We shoot ourselves in the foot, really, when it comes to our economy and the predictability here in the United States and the faith of the federal government. when we can't even come together on whether or not we're going to fund critical services. I'm very concerned about the long-term impacts of people pulling out from investments already with what's happened over the last year. We estimate that over $1 billion of investments going to go elsewhere. Are you concerned with our ability just to function and what the long-term impacts are to our economy?
The thing that I'm concerned about is one that is a subject of proverb after proverb. History is the best teacher. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. There are lessons. History is rife with them that we need to be paying attention to. And that's my concern. My concern is we're often in a rush to perhaps take action when we really should take the time, as the ranking member of the full committee said, get the facts. And that is something that does seem to be spare these days. And so I would encourage, look, the fact that this hearing is occurring is an example where it's not happening in this committee right now, but it is in other places, and we absolutely need to adhere to the lessons that have already been learned.
The advantage that we've had in the United States is that people believe when they invest here that this is a country that they will be able to prosper in, and we need to make sure that that continues. I really appreciate the conversation, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we go to the gentlelady from California. Ms. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. There is no question that Xi Jinping is looking to harness the power of emerging technologies deployed by the private sector to integrate with the People's Liberation Army's military weapons. Now, the question is how we can curb the flow of capital into China to help in the development of emerging technologies like AI and quantum computing. We need to implement a time-tested approach that includes our partners and allies, because our country cannot unilaterally reduce capital flows into the CCP. We need a clear strategy. So earlier there was a discussion, and I want to ask you for a clarification. Does Representative Barr's bill use the existing list we've been discussing in the hearing? Is that the approach? I'm asking you, Mr. Ashooh.
Thank you. It does. No, I think the strength of the bill is that it leverages a time-tested and effective, already existing tool that the U.S. has.
Both Mr. Ashooh and Mr. Feddo, in your view, how can we incentivize a multilateral approach to curbing the financing of emerging technologies in China? Do you believe imposing targeted sanctions can help? Mr. Feddo, you can go first.
I do think a multilateral approach can help. I do think that the targeted approach is important. As I suggested in my testimony, I think it's probably a combination of types of sanctions that would be most effective in this context. I agree with my colleagues that using targeted export controls, a sanctions-like regime that also involves export controls would be important, but the entity-focused approach is immediate and very efficient. I'll also just quickly say that it appears that venture capital investment and private equity investment into startups from the United States or from foreign investors writ large is incredibly down over the last few years. It's hard to say how much of that is actually smart money that is bringing something along with the investment that would be of benefit. And that executive order, for example, 14105, focuses on those intangibles. But the importance of doing an entity approach or a sanctions approach is there's a huge ecosystem of consultants and advisors and others from the United States who provide those exact same intangibles, managerial experience, an understanding of relationships and networks and other types of guidance that would be prohibited by an entity-based or sanctions-based approach.
Would allies and partners be more willing to work with the United States to screen investments or to impose targeted sanctions?
I think the jury's out on that. Just a few days ago, the European Union, the European Commission released a white paper on whether or not it's going to create outbound investment controls similar to the United States. And essentially it said, we're going to take 2 years to collect data and decide if we even need to do this 2 years from now. So there's a lot of work to be done on the sort of screening approach or the new outbound investment approach. I think it would be, personally, I think given that so many countries around the world, allies and partners of the United States, are familiar with economic sanctions, and we've done them in a multilateral way, and export controls, by the way, in a multilateral way, that I think that there would be much more momentum in that regard.
I believe, we all believe, a key to ensuring emerging technologies do not fall into the hands of our adversaries like China is to get our partners and allies on board with similar protective measures. I think we agree on that. Let me ask you, Mr. Ashooh, are sanctions a time-tested and effective national security tool? And what would be the advantage of placing any regime into companies of concern under jurisdiction of Treasury's OFAC?
Because it's time-tested and effective. Again, the number one problem with a new regime is that it would automatically start by not being multilateral, because we'd be the only ones doing it. And that would be a disadvantage to the U.S. The SDN list, while it's not necessarily the product of a multilateral approach, it is well known and well regarded by our allies and friends. And that gives it strength. We cannot go it alone on this. In the U.S. export control system, if you're worried about a particular technology, such as artificial intelligence or any other emerging technology, that is already the subject of a multilateral process. That process can then be leveraged into the financing. So working with time-tested, effective tools should be the place where we start.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back.
Gentlelady, time's it up. Excuse me, gentlelady's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. A number of you have mentioned on the collapse of foreign direct investment into China. It's actually gone negative in recent times. And I think the canary in the coal mine here were the Korean shipbuilders who tried to, after multi-billion dollars invested, concluded they were never really going to be profitable, tried to get their money out, and had to walk away from it. And this happened years ago. I've been a little bit unhappy with the fact that even though this is very obvious to many observers, the mainstream financial media, I think, did not present a fair view of what the dangers were. I think that a large part of it is that a lot of the interest groups that make their careers dealing with China weren't willing to acknowledge the problem as quickly as it was obvious to a lot of observers. Do you think I'm correct in that? Has there been a lag in getting the problem, in getting your money out of China recognized? Or is that just something? My wife is Korean, so she gave me early warning a few years ago that certainly the Korean press, they understood that the difficulty in getting money out. I was just wondering if you share my impression there.
I'm not a student of the dynamic you're referring to, but it sure makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay. Now, the big story this week is the collapse of Evergrande, which is referred to by some of the wags as the largest of the endemic real estate firms, which is an interesting adjective. And they have something like $300 billion in debt and $20 billion in foreign debt. Do we have any reading on whether the foreign investors are going to be treated fairly in that liquidation or not? Or do you have a guess?
I'd be worried.
I'm not aware of any indication.
Any indication, yeah, because I think that is something we all have to look at. Because the reason you invest in places like China is at some point you expect to get your profits out. It's unclear to me, for example, whether Tesla investors are ever going to get their money out when they're faced with, a level of subsidy where there are gigantic, I think you look on Bloomberg and they have these videos of gigantic graveyards of electric vehicles that were manufactured not to be used but to capture their subsidies. You can look at the Chinese success in capturing the solar panel market, but they've done this and they've just lost their shirt on that investment. And you can make the argument that our best play there is to simply say, okay, you're going to subsidize your solar panels to that extent. Let's just buy everything, buy everything cheaper than the cost of production from them, get our, decarbonize our economy, and then slowly convert to a U.S. manufacturing base for next generation solar panels. And so I think we have to be strategic in this. And I think that what the Biden administration, for example, in solar panels, their pragmatic approach should say, look, to decarbonize our economy, we're going to have to continue buying over-subsidized Chinese panels and let them lose money manufacturing them. We'll decarbonize our economy and then concentrate on next generation. That seems like a very good strategic management of this. Now, Ms. Kilcrease, you've mentioned the importance of thoughtful collaboration with our allies. And this is another thing that sort of gives me heartburn about what the administration is doing and a lot of the rhetoric on Capitol Hill. That it seems to me that if we're going to draw a fence around our economy, that fence shouldn't be drawn at the borders of the United States, but around the free economies of the world, the free democracies of the world. And so I am not worried that, for example, if key components in the semiconductor supply chain go through Japan, for example, or Korea. And the only reason to be worried about Taiwan, frankly, is the military threat there, not there. And so how do we best handle that? And do you have any comments on what the administration might be able to do better?
Thank you for the question. It's so important, as we've all noted, the importance of working with our allies, and it's absolutely right. I mean, we need to be thinking about techno-democracies and how we can work together to identify those technologies that will be critical and make sure that our institutions are fit for purpose. There's an ongoing conversation, for example, about the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is one of our key export control regimes that includes Russia. And does not enable the same sort of robust country-specific concerns as we might want in the China context. So there's a lot of analytic and diplomatic work that the United States needs to push forward to make sure that we have the structures in place to, again, identify these areas of strategic technologies of shared concern with our key allies, and then make sure we have our domestic authorities aligned and make sure we've got cooperation mechanisms so that we can align FDI screening and export controls and whatever additional tools that may be coming down the line.
Yeah, thank you. And when you figure that out, please let us know. It's complicated. Thank you. My time's up.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Dela Cruz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us. Decades of trade has enriched China, while DC bureaucrats have believed that including them in the U.S.-led global system would make China open up and become a cooperative part of that system. Unfortunately, this was not the case. China has greatly profited from trading with us, while at the same time challenging our interests around the globe, supporting undemocratic countries that invade our neighbors like Russia, and sending deadly fentanyl to our country, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans. As we look toward the future of our relationship with China, we must acknowledge that we live in an extraordinary time, one of the rapidly transforming technology that will redefine the 21st century and the country that gets to lead it. As the most innovative country in the world, it is in our national interest to protect our technology and not let it get into the hands of adversarial nations like China. Mr. Ashooh and Mr. Feddo, can you explain how the Chinese military-industrial complex has relied on U.S. technology and expertise to boost their own industry?
Your question gets to the heart of why export controls matter and why we talk so much about both those tools being specific and multilateral, so that we can control the flow of technology. And it's worked well for the United States to consider China a market, but it's also worked well for the United States to significantly and impactfully restrict commerce when it's in our national security interests, which it has been. There's a great deal that we allow to go to China, and there's also a great deal that we don't. The challenge is, as we're discussing today, it's not just about technology in the form of commodities or technology in the form of information. It's also in the form of dollars, and that's why we need to evolve and deal with the threats as they emerge, and this is one we're talking about today.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that. my understanding that the PRC takes a whole of government approach to this situation that you've described. Civil-military fusion is real, and that's why I believe that the U.S. government has to have a whole of government approach as well, whether it's export controls, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the FBI and the Justice Department prosecuting the commercial espionage and the theft of intellectual property in the United States. All of that has to be fully resourced and prosecuted aggressively to protect and defend against those attempts by the military-industrial complex in China.
Thank you. And how much growth is the U.S. losing to China when they steal our technology or build high-tech industries on the back of U.S. technology?
It's a difficult thing to put a dollar figure on, but it's significant. That said, the challenge for the U.S. is to stay current with Chinese efforts to poach U.S. technology. And has already been mentioned is this concept of military-civil fusion, which was an unrealized goal for many, many years until President Xi forced it into reality and made, quite frankly, the U.S.'s export control regime's job harder, ensuring that technology didn't end up in the wrong place. Again, that's part of the reason why we need to talk about the funding of such technologies, because it's a potential gap.
And one last question, how much of that do you know is from espionage as opposed from cooperative business relationships?
Personally, I could not put a figure on that. It's a great question, though.
I don't have the number either, but I know the FBI director has repeatedly testified before Congress about opening up investigations related to Chinese commercial espionage, one every 12 hours. So I don't know if those numbers still stick, but it's a significant effort by the Chinese government.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we will the gentleman from Connecticut. Mr. Himes is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for this really interesting conversation. I want to drill in a little bit. I used to work in the capital markets, and I'm actually ranking member of the Intelligence Committee right now, so I have a pretty good feel for the propagation of technology and what works and what doesn't. You know, I understand the instinct very much that if there is a rogue or a company that is serving the PLA's interest in some nefarious way, that we might want to bring a whole of government approach against it. But I hear constantly this idea that why should we fund our own demise? And I'm in politics, so I understand the attraction of that statement, but I think it's worthy of some scrutiny. So here's a thought experiment I'd love to have you answer. It's I think, a real world example. Let's pick a really scary technology that we don't want the Chinese beat us to. Let's just pick, cryptographically relevant quantum computing, right? This is important. Now, there's a Chinese company that is doing cryptographically relevant computing. They've done qubits in a scalable way. We really care about this. Door A, they invite, in a $100 million early round, they invite U.S. venture capital in. With that comes 4 weeks of due diligence, regular updates on the progress of the company, maybe a board seat, U.S. venture capitalist. Door B is a Belarusian shady investor in that early round. No due diligence for U.S. companies, no board seat for U.S. companies. Do we walk through door A or door B? Quickly, we don't need to talk about it a lot, but do you have strong preferences about door A versus door B?
I'd pick door A.
Door A. Anybody picking door B here? Nobody's picking door B.
No, and what door A does offer is something we talked about earlier, which is insight.
Insight.
I'm
ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. We spend $85 billion-ish a year trying to collect information on this sort of thing. And again, nobody is saying door B here. Everybody is saying, let's do the 4 weeks of due diligence, let's do the site visits, let's get the board seats because we want that information. We don't want the Belarusian angel investor to get that information. One of you worked on CFIUS. Emily was, okay, two of you worked, philosophy of CFIUS, as I understand it, from 1968 onward, was that we perceive antagonistic adversarial companies' investments in our economies as a risk, as providing benefit to potentially China and risk to us. So as we talk about restricting investment into Chinese innovative companies, are we not implementing a Chinese CFIUS program, which adds risk to us and benefit to them? Help me understand why we're not implementing a reverse CFIUS in assistance of China. Help me understand that.
Well, it's a little bit of logic jujitsu there. I mean, I get your point.
It's not jiu-jitsu. I think it's called the converse.
CFIUS is created to do exactly to prevent exactly what you described behind, for example, door A, right? I'm not advocating for a CFIUS like structure with respect to outbound investment. My position is there are clearly entities in China that are affiliated with the Chinese military and should be off limits for services that an intangible support that Americans could provide to the advancement of those high-tech companies.
Yep, I got it. And don't get me wrong, again, I spend a lot of my time on national security, so when there's cutting-edge research being done, innovations being done that could pose a threat, I want us to know about them. I want us to be there first. I want us to know about them. I think the idea of foreclosing the opportunity for friendly capital to go there is precisely counterproductive to that. I also have concerns about whether, I appreciate, sanctions I think are a powerful tool. Multilateral action is a tool. There's a lot of sources of money out there. Do you think the U.S. is ever going to succeed in cutting off all of the sources of capital to roguish, dangerous companies? Does anybody believe that? Okay. I also have concerns, by the way, about effectiveness. In 2022, the Biden administration forbids the sale of 14-nanometer technology, semiconductor technology, to China. Last year, Huawei came out with a Mate 60 Pro phone. What is the semiconductor in a Mate 60 Huawei phone? Anybody know?
I believe it's 7 nanometers.
7 nanometers. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That will go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty, for holding this important hearing and permitting me to participate in it. Today's topic is crucial. The People's Republic of China is America's foremost strategic competitor. It has 1.4 billion people and is the second largest economy in the world. In crucial technology sectors, the PRC has shown that not only can it copy American tech, but it can compete and innovate. The balance of power between the United States and China depends on which country can create and harness the technologies that will power both the economies and the militaries of tomorrow. Outbound legislation addressing PRC technological development should comprehensively, in my belief, limit American investments in crucial technologies, but also should do so in a targeted way without shooting ourselves in the foot. In my view, the legislation that balances these equities, of course, is H.R. 6349. We've done this bill in a bipartisan way. I've co-led it as the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, along with Chairman Michael McCall. An outbound regime that combines transparency and prohibitions on investments in the most sensitive technology sectors is the best way to safeguard United States national security, while at the same time maintaining open global capital flows and the United States' preeminent position in the global markets. So with that, I wanted to just ask a few questions about what would help delineate between the different approaches to address the outbound issue. And so I'll start with Ms. Kilcrease. And Mr. Himes talked about CFIUS. So I was wondering if you could tell us what are some of the critical problems that an outbound regime should tackle that cannot be addressed through our existing CFIUS sanctions and export control regimes?
Yes, thank you for the important question. I do think that we can leverage existing tools to a good extent to get at these issues, but of course, there is a gap. CFIUS deals with investment in our U.S. market, not outbound investments, so that's not the appropriate tool. Export controls can do a lot of heavy lifting here, but they're not designed to get at the financing that can flow along with a technology transfer. And so as we think about constructing a new set of tools or strengthening our existing tools, I think there's a lot of synergies, for lack of a better word, between the various proposals that have been put on the table. I actually don't see a technology-based approach that leverages existing export control lists as mutually exclusive with an entity-based approach. I think those can work in tandem, so long as we make sure that we're not setting up an intensive screening process, and that we are creating very clear technical rules that the private sector can comply with. So I think we can leverage the best of some of the ideas that have been coming out of this debate.
So on that, can you give me what are the benefits of utilizing, say, a sector-based approach of countries of concern instead of having a case-by-case or a review or a company-by-company-based review? What's the differences, and what do you see the pros and the cons are? I start Ms. Kilcrease, and if someone else want to jump in on that, that's fine.
Yeah, so I think the benefit of a technology-based approach is that it, first of all, it aligns with where the U.S. government is headed on export controls anyways. The novel thing in the October 7th export controls released by the administration was they set a cut line, a pretty clear technical cut line that said above this threshold, you cannot do a technology export to China because whether it's civilian or for military purposes, it is a de facto national security risk. And so I think there's a lot of logic in applying that sort of countrywide bright line test using clear technical specifications in your sort of sector-based approach. I think there's a lot of logic to that, and it gets to some of these concerns we've heard about military-civil fusion and the process for listing entities. So I personally believe that having a technology-based approach, again, leveraging what we're doing in the export control context, makes a lot of sense.
I want to get one thing in, because I know Mr. Ashooh is working for a leading American semiconductor tool company that creates some of the most complicated machinery in the world. Most of those firms that lead in this space are American, but several are also Japanese and European. Can you talk about the importance of the multilateral approach that someone was talking about for any American policy?
It's critical to, I don't think we can stress enough the importance of any approach being multilateral, especially in advanced technology. There's this alluring thought that just because the U.S. is the most innovative country in the world, that we have all lock on all the emerging and critical technologies. We don't. Many other countries will speed ahead of us if we restrict without that kind of collaboration. So I credit you for asking the question because it's something that can't be stressed enough.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized.
Thank the subcommittee for allowing me to participate. As I think the gentlewoman from Texas pointed out, we have an enormous trade deficit with China because we granted them most favored nation status. We therefore have a trade deficit of over $1/3 of $1 trillion every year. That means they have built up every decade $3 trillion that they can spend or invest. The idea that we can prevent them from being able to fund this $20 million project or this $60 million project is kind of silly. If Americans can't invest in a particular company on the Shanghai Exchange, its price may drop a little bit. Chinese investors will see that that's a buying opportunity and the stock will go back up. But while we can't prevent China from funding $20 million here, $50 million there, we can discourage the export of American technology. And it's one thing to say, oh, here's a fully drafted plan and somebody's going to sell it for $40 million and we're going to prevent the export of that technology. But often technology is know-how. It's a connection. It's an idea. And when an American company has an incentive to provide that to a Chinese partner, it will be provided. The best example of this was we had American companies contract with China to put their satellites in orbit. So what did our companies do? They told the Chinese, how to do a better job with their rockets. And so did our insurance companies who were insuring those launches. So we want to discourage joint ventures, major venture capital investments by people in the United States who have ideas and have knowledge and contacts that they could pass on. Now, while we can't starve China for investment capital, we don't need to incentivize it. We have a capital gains allowance in our tax system. The thinking is that we should forego tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars of tax revenue to encourage people to buy stock which builds the economy. Well, when they buy stock in a Chinese company, they're building the economy of China. Ms. Kelsey, can you think of a reason why we should provide very enormous tax incentives for people to invest in Chinese companies?
I can't, sir. That does sound interesting.
Does any of our other witnesses think it's a good idea to provide the capital gains allowance and the step up in basis upon death as investment incentives when you're investing in Chinese companies? One word answer? I see one witness, I think both of you are shaking your heads no? Yes, well, for the record. We've got one oral no and two nonverbal no's. Now, you know, if it was my preference, we wouldn't have American capital flowing to China at all, except we have a certain vulnerability because we have this huge trade deficit. They've got a lot of money, and we need them to invest it in the United States. And while stock investments and equity investments are roughly equal, going in both directions, they have more than $1 trillion more of debt capital that they provide the United States. Now, debt capital isn't as valuable to our economy as equity capital, but it's $1 trillion. So it's very hard to say we're going to stop, we're going to cut the flow of capital in one direction. But I will point out, as that capital gains allowance, China has investment incentives for its own people to invest in Chinese stocks. They don't provide those incentives to invest in the United States stocks. So there's certain fairness there. And finally, I'll point out, as to the trade deficit, we have tariffs on China, their tariffs on our goods higher, and they can orally instruct their companies not to buy American goods. And we can't prove it, we can't know about it, they just don't buy. And that's why we have a huge trade deficit. That's why we need much higher tariffs on Chinese goods to make up for their non-tariff and non-disclosed barriers. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on all these matters. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the panel for being here today. I'm very happy to see that Chairman Barr is leading out this bill to really protect U.S. consumers, the American-based industry, and ultimately combat what we have seen, a very aggressive buyout by China of U.S. technology that ultimately is going to come back to roost right here in the United States from a national security perspective. So I want to start here with this conversation on, Emily, we served on the National Security Council together. I was before your time, but really talking about, from a counterintelligence threat here, building up a foundation to be successful here. We talk about the entity-based list. I think we can all agree, but I want to ask you from your perspective here, the entity-based list provides us a foundation. As I understand it, really only the Barr bill is doing that at this point. I think there are other bills that could come in here, the EO. Talk to us about the advantages of the entity-based list.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Look, I think where the government has knowledge that there's a particular entity that's acting against our national security interests, we should list them, whether it's a full blocking sanction or other sorts of sanctions. We've got a varied toolbox, and we should think about a range of escalation options within that toolbox, including the full blocking, but perhaps not always the full blocking sanction. The private sector, they want clarity, and one way that you can provide clarity is by listing those specific entities that the U.S. government knows is a problem. And so, while again, I don't think this is the only way to tackle the problem, I do think it's an important part of the overall solution.
I would agree with you. In fact, to speak of clarity, we were proud to lead the Clarity Act, which said specifically what the U.S. government had to do. One of the things we tackle on the NSC was Huawei and what they were bringing into the system. This provided a clear safeguard, a red light, green light option, really, for the federal government to know what technology they could invest in and then which ones were going to be potentially dangerous. I want to speak quickly with you, Mr. Ashooh, here. Given your background on the artificial intelligence piece, you've got a background in electronic warfare. I'd like to talk about the critical role that AI is going to play on that. Could you share with us, as an example, where this would be very important, that this technology is something we need to keep home at roost here?
So my specific area of electronic warfare was in the countermeasures space. And it's all about speed of reaction and understanding threats from non-threats. And AI is going to be a game changer in many, many ways, but that's the one that I'm particularly paying attention to, because we're talking about human lives in planes and other platforms that are going to be dependent on our ability to stay ahead.
As an RC-135 guy myself, I really appreciate your leadership.
Thank you for your service.
Same to you. I think we recognize that. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd actually like to yield my time to Chairman Barr here for a follow-up.
I thank my friend from Iowa for yielding time, because his questions are always so provocative and helpful to us understanding what's going on here. Mr. Feddo, let me just conclude our hearing here today by asking you a question about a criticism of the OFAC sanctions approach. Those who have advocated for this sector-based approach have made the argument that Treasury just simply doesn't do it. Treasury doesn't do the job they need to do in restricting capital flows to Chinese entities of national security concern. And specifically what they say is that an OFAC sanctions approach or a full blocking SDN sanctions approach is so powerful that Treasury is reluctant to actually use it. And Treasury will not designate entities in that scenario because it is so powerful. What is the, and they've cited, and this is a legitimate point, they've cited Treasury's decision to not designate Hikvision, for example. Tell us why that shouldn't be a concern.
Well, first of all, being a Treasury alum, I'll defend Treasury a little bit in this respect. As anyone who is plugged into the national security apparatus and government functions, Treasury is the implementer, administrator, and enforcer of economic sanctions. It doesn't act in a vacuum and make decisions about who to designate or to sanction. That is that's a State Department, Treasury, the NSC, the White House. They all make that decision. So if there hasn't been additions to the list, that's because the White House and the executive branch as a whole have made that decision. The one advantage of your bill is that you hold, and this is why I've been advocating for any solution in this respect regarding outbound investment restrictions, is that it be done legislatively. You can put safeguards in and hold the government accountable and justify to the Congress why X or Y has not been named to a list.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I thank our witnesses for all of their testimony. Without objection, I'd like to enter without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is now adjourned. Thank you, sir. Thank you.